So today we're going to be starting the second part of this course, a little bit delayed because of the strike from last week. Apologies for that. But in any case, what we're going to be doing today is starting the component where we look at how to go beyond the canonical approaches from philosophy. So the first part of the course was looking at the limitations of the canon and some of the ways that it falls short of what we would consider an ideal approach to study these topics of philosophical interest. So in the second part of the course, we look at concrete methods for how to do that. Today we're going to be looking at feminist philosophy, feminist epistemology and philosophy of science. One thing to be said though, this is a huge discipline. So feminist epistemology, for example, has been going on for around 30 or so years, and there's so many developments in feminist epistemology that it's hard to keep track. So today I'm going to be focusing mainly on feminist epistemology and building on the arguments for it to then talk about feminist philosophy of science. As we'll see, they're very close to one another. So the approach we're going to be looking at today is kind of defining a canonical way of doing epistemology and then showing how we can depart from these canonical approaches by doing feminist analysis of mainstream epistemology. What I like about this is that it's like kind of an applied way of doing feminist epistemology on itself. We'll see how that is an interesting way of approaching the methods of feminist epistemology. And one thing to be said, this is going to be the trend in all of my lectures in the second part of the course. We start off by saying, this is a canonical way of doing philosophy. And then we say, this is an alternative method of doing philosophy, and it breaks with the canonical ways in these manners. So this is always going to be the structure. I'll today start off by saying, this is the canonical way of doing epistemology, namely mainstream epistemology. We move on from that to do feminist epistemology, and we show exactly how it represents a break with the canon and how it goes beyond the canon, okay? This is also going to be informative for the essay that you guys are supposed to write at the end of the course. So what I'm going to do at the end of every single lecture is say how you can use the contents of that lecture to do the essay or to do the assignment for the second part of the course. Is that clear? One question that I was received is, when do the grades of the midterm come out? I don't know. That's Claudia's business. Claudia is the one who is grading the midterm. So I'm not your man. Ask Claudia. She's your man. Well, that on the table, let's look at mainstream epistemology. So if we're going to define what is the mainstream approach to study of epistemology, we need to kind of provide some definition of what epistemology is. So, are you guys ready for the definition of epistemology? Here it comes. Voila. Very informative. And there's a reason why we're being so uninformative about this, and that is because this is a huge topic of controversy. It's very hard to define exactly what counts as epistemology and what does not count as epistemology. Indeed, it is a common topic of discussion within epistemologists themselves. It is something that pops up all the time. But I think there's at least one way that we can make progress on this question, that is by looking at what epistemology is about. What is this epistemic? And the way that I do that is looking at the stuff of epistemology. Let's try to use the microphone again because I prefer that. Yeah, I think it's not working, that's why. So if we're going to talk about what the stuff of epistemology is, it is what is the object of study? What do epistemologists want to look into? And that's somewhat simple to answer. So one thing that is usually said to be about epistemology or epistemology is studying is knowledge. I don't think this is a mystery to anyone. If you think about what epistemologists study, knowledge is the main target. And the kinds of questions that we have in mind here for epistemologists is, what does it take for a subject S to know something? That's the kind of common question of epistemologists. But it's not restricted to only knowledge. We can also talk about understanding as being critical for epistemology. So what does it take for S to understand something or to not understand something? And so on and so forth for the things that epistemologists are interested in. So my definition of what is epistemology, mainstream epistemology, it is the study of these kinds of things. So it is the study of the epistemic. Right, so far so good. So what is characteristic then of mainstream epistemology? What makes it so that we're talking about mainstream epistemology and not anything else? Here I find that there's a very simple way of doing so, that is trying to get to how mainstream epistemologists try to answer these kinds of questions. Here's how they do it. They say, S knows that P if and only if something happens. Or we want to know what understanding is, we start with S understands that P if and only if something happens. So when you're doing epistemology, you're trying to fill in what is going on in the end of these kinds of sentences. There's more that's involved in epistemology, mainstream epistemology. There's questions about what is epistemic virtue, do we have any kind of knowledge? Let's not worry about this for now. I mean, there's a lot that goes on in epistemology. I just want to focus on these kinds of claims of that sort. So to do epistemology is to try to fill in whatever the hell is happening at the end of these kinds of sentences. I'll show you why this is informative in just a second. But first understand why this is a good way of approaching it. We have to understand that in mainstream epistemology, there is a crucial distinction between epistemology and the other things that are going on in philosophy. So on this mainstream picture, we have the mothership philosophy, and from it we derive the different areas. We have ethics, metaphysics, logic, and epistemology. These are the classic branches of philosophy. Where I did my PhD, there was actually a division. So there were two doors to the department. One door was for the metaphysicians, logicians, and epistemologists, and the other door was for the ethicists. They were separate kinds of institutes. And the idea there is that these branches of study, they are really different from each other. This is going to prove very important in a second. You can fill it out with more. There can be like aesthetics, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, political philosophy. In any case, what's important is for mainstream epistemology is they consider themselves to be something separate from all the other branches and something very, very unique. What does he mean by that? Well, let's make a little example here. Let's get a kind of classic question in ethics. Is it morally permissible for me to eat my partner's cake in the fridge? Yes, obviously, right? There's no doubt about that one. But the kind of question that we have here about moral permissibility presumably doesn't really have any impact on what it takes to know something. So questions in epistemology are supposedly irrelevant to whether it is okay, permissibly, morally permissible, for you to eat your partner's chocolate cake in the fridge. Or what makes something just or unjust in politics or in life. Again, the idea of mainstream epistemology is that nothing about what is knowledge or understanding helps you to answer this question. They are different kinds of things. So, is it wrong for me to be a hedonist? What are the duties that I have towards my neighbor? All these questions, according to mainstream epistemology, are a different kind of branch and are disconnected from epistemology, which are, again, just these kinds of questions. What is knowledge? What does it take to know things? What does it take to understand things? So they're independent realms. Likewise for aesthetics. What makes something beautiful opposed to ugly? Again, this has no connection to epistemology. They're different branches. So the core claim of mainstream epistemology is that the epistemic realm is somehow independent and importantly so from other kinds of realms. So it's a free-floating domain that's unaffected by what is morally the case, aesthetically the case, or politically the case. Here's a way of illustrating this. I believe it's raining today. Why? Because that's aesthetically beautiful for me. I think it's just nice to consider myself believing that it's raining today. That seems off, right? Or for example, oh, I believe my neighbor is a nice guy. Why? Because aesthetically to me, that seems like the right thing to do. That doesn't seem like the right thing to do. You should believe your neighbor is a nice guy if you have evidence that that's the case, if your belief is justified that your neighbor is a nice guy. So what is relevant for what you know or believe is just what is pertaining to epistemology. So critically, the way that mainstream epistemologists try to fill in the end of these sentences is going to be only epistemic stuff. So S knows that P if and only if. At the end of that sentence, you can only include knowledge, understanding, belief, justification. Only these kinds of things can come at the end of those sentences. That is the core view of epistemology. Mainstream epistemology, sorry. So far, so good. But then, what's the problem with this? Well, let's give you some examples. Take the case that you are at the train station and you're waiting to get the train that you know stops in Reeshof, right? So you're at the train station here in Tilburg Central, and then someone comes to you and says, do you know if the train that's coming up now stops in Reeshof? You've taken that train many times, many times. And you know, every time that you've taken that train, it stops in Reeshof. And you say, yeah, it does. And the person says, oh, good, I'm taking a heart for a heart transplant, and if it doesn't stop in Reeshof, someone will die. At that point, do you know that the train stops in Reeshof, or are you going to check your phone, your NS app? You're probably going to check your NS app. So whether you know whether the train stops in Reeshof seems to vary depending on how high the stakes of the situation are. Who here had a different response? Who here thinks that once you learn about the situation, you still know that the train stops in the Reeshof? Raise your hand. One person?
But it's highly dependent on the context. So with a train, I would be just as sure that if it's something I would, it differs from.
Yeah, indeed. So the name of this view is called contextualism.
Yeah.
So the context in which you're located in and what's at stake in that context is going to somehow impact on what you know or do not know. Likewise, for example, like you know that the bank is usually open on Saturday mornings, and then someone says to you, is the bank open on Saturdays? Yes. Oh, because I need to take the mortgage, pay my mortgage. If I don't, I'm going to lose my house. At that point, you're going to check your phone and see maybe it's not going to open because it's on Sunday it's going to be Easter, right? So again, the context and the stakes seem to somehow matter for whether we know or don't know things. Here's a more complex scenario, one that I find more tricky, and intuitions are more divided. This is a real case. There is a black man hosting a challah in a very big room, and in this challah, he is the only black person that is attending the event. There are other 99 black men attending the event as well, but they're all waiters. So one black man attended the event as the host, all the other 99 black men are waiters. In comes the very elegant woman, takes off her coat, hands it to this black man and says, waiter, could you take my coat? Who finds it's not okay for her to believe that this guy is a waiter, given that he is the host of the party? Who finds it's okay? Interest is divided, right? But to those who find it's not okay, why is it not okay? Yeah.
Like it's a weird assumption to make. Like you should be informed about who the host of the party you're going to. You should not just make assumptions about people, like based on how they look.
Yeah, but then think of the following situation. You're sitting at a cafe, and you see one person come out with their hair nicely cut. Usually they just cut their hair, right? And then you see another one. Then you see another one. Then you see another one. And you count, you see 99 people come out with their haircut. And you see, oh, there's a hair salon just around the corner. And it's like, oh, that explains it. And then you see another person pass by. Is it okay to maybe infer that person also cut their hair there?
I suppose the difference is in the action of just, you're making this person uncomfortable. Well, if I ask somebody, hey, did you get your haircut over there?
Yeah.
It's very different to me.
Right. So it's kind of hard to explain why we think it's not okay. It's like something about the moral situation, something about like what we owe to people. Like, so there's something else going on here, right? There's something tricky that we want to say, maybe it's not okay for this person to believe though. Even though her chance of getting it right is 99%. It's really high chances that she got it right, but she just got it wrong, and somehow that seems really bad for us. At least for most people. Some people disagree about this. Why am I bringing out these cases? Well, because they illustrate something interesting for us. The train case, it illustrates that although you take yourself to know that the train stops in Reishof, when the stakes become very high, that affects what you take yourself to know or not know. And similar for the club case, for the Chala, statistically speaking, the woman's belief is highly reliable. Really, really reliable. But when we realize that it involves these kinds of weird moral consequences, then we would like to say that she shouldn't have believed that. So moral factors affect what we believe or what we should or should not believe. Lesson. Questions about morality and questions about the stakes, what is important and not important to us, seem to somehow matter for whether we consider someone to know or not know something. Why is this relevant for us? Well, remember, mainstream epistemologists want to say that the only thing that can go at the end of these sentences is epistemic stuff. I can only talk about knowledge, belief, justification, nothing else. However, what these cases show to us is that something like moral and pragmatic factors also seem to have a place there. We also want to include them as relevant for whether people know or don't know things. Feminist epistemology essentially is saying exactly that. It is saying that at the end of those sentences, if you're trying to do epistemology, you cannot just include epistemic stuff. Questions about morality, questions about politics, questions about what is important or not important do have a place. So gender, sex, and related factors, they do have an importance for us for determining what it is to know or not know something, to understand or not understand. So what are some example questions? Well, what does it take for a woman to know something? Well, as we know from society, women are generally credited as less knowing than men. There's a lot of empirical studies on this. And basically this implies that, does S know that P? Well, is S a woman or a man? That matters. So the epistemic standards for women tend to, apparently, are higher than they are for men. Or are women often disregarded as reliable epistemic agents? Again, does a woman know or not know? That's different from does a man know or not know? Or these kinds of questions, are minorities better positioned to speak about certain issues because they are minorities? So these questions, essentially, what they're doing at their core is saying, S knows that P, if and only if, moral, pragmatic, gender, sex, these kinds of questions are also pertaining to whether we know or don't know things. Do you guys get that? And that's the huge leap that a feminist epistemology makes. It makes a leap into thinking that these kinds of questions, these kinds of elements, have an importance for doing epistemology. So, there's a big debate here about whether we should put sex or gender here. I don't want to get into that here. I'll just use sex for now. Some people prefer to talk about gender. I don't know, it's tricky. Do you guys get this so far? Yep. Any questions before we proceed? Because it's important we have this in mind before we proceed. Have you guys seen this stuff before? You seem slightly bored. Okay. So we have this kind of picture that feminist epistemologists are kind of arguing for. You can't just focus on epistemic stuff. So this is the break with the canon. We break with the canon insofar as we add other things at the end of those sentences. What do mainstream epistemologists say in response to this? Well, they say, yeah, we see where you're getting at. It seems relevant, but there's something wrong about this. And here's a joke to illustrate this. The Parachik, which is someone who worked in the Soviet Union, asks impatiently to the mathematician, how much is 2 plus 2? And the mathematician says, scared of the regime, how much do you want it to be? The joke here is that when you have politics interfering in science or in mathematics, something goes wrong. It's something wrong when fear of the government influences your answer to very even basic mathematical questions. So what mainstream epistemologists usually say in response to feminist epistemologists is that there's an inherent danger of relativism that shows up when you go for feminist epistemology. Because if you make epistemology relative to sex or gender, I'm not going to get into that debate here, you end up forming one concept of knowledge for man, a concept of understanding for man, evidence for man, justified belief for man, and so on and so forth, and another concept of these same things for women. And this is weird. It's weird when you have knowledge for men being different from knowledge for women, understanding men, understanding women, because knowledge, understanding, etc., it all becomes relative. And this is even further complicated when you think about, well, okay, we've just divided men and women, but how about when you think about women of color or black women? This is tricky because then you create a further division. It is, you have men, women, and women of color. All a different concept of knowledge, all a different concept of understanding. And you also add to that social class, or you add to that coming from a certain nation. So when you start making these kinds of factors relevant for epistemology, you get an explosion of notions of knowledge. So do you know if it's going to rain tomorrow? Well, it depends. Are you a man, white, born in Brazil, raised in the UK, and then lives in the Netherlands? Then I know in that sense. But I don't know in another sense where I was born in Brazil, for example. And that becomes weird. We just start operating with just too many notions of knowledge. And to make matters worse, feminist epistemologists, they also very clear that feminism is a political project. To advocate for feminist values is to really go for a political agenda. A large part of next lecture will be actually showing a big criticism of feminists against feminist epistemology as we know, or feminist philosophy as we know it, by showing that a lot of feminist epistemology as we know it is a political program that is colonizing. So it's going to be a cool addition to today's lecture. But in any case, feminist epistemologists are very aware that their program is a political one. But if politics influences epistemology, then what you know depends on, for example, your political affiliation. So do you know something in the sense that you vote for the DSS, or because you vote for the VVD? Or do you know something because you vote for the GroenLinks? I mean, knowledge just becomes like this concept that is worthless now. Like knowledge, there's just too many different types of knowledge. So that can't be right. So to say that knowledge depends on who you vote for seems like a weird consequence if we include politics as determining of epistemology. It makes it almost ridiculous. So the conclusion that mainstream epistemologists want to push here is that, okay, there are some cases that seem to show that questions like pragmatic factors, what is important or not important, getting the heart into Reishoff, matters for what we know or don't know, or questions about morality, such as the woman shouldn't have believed that the guy was a waiter. Those things seem to push us to thinking that moral and pragmatic factors matter for epistemology. But that's a mistake. Epistemology is an independent realm, or else we get this explosion of relativism, and it's really bad for us. So we can reject moral and, pragmatic encroachment. And instead, we should abandon feminist philosophy because that leads to relativism. So we should just stick with mainstream epistemology. So what I think is relevant for us to take from this first part of the lecture is we have mainstream epistemology, and we have very strong inclinations to go for something like feminist epistemology because of the examples that I gave. However, there is a threat in going towards feminist epistemology. There's a threat of relativism. What becomes knowledge, what becomes understanding, I don't know. It varies depending on where you come from, who you are, and it becomes an irrelevant concept in the end. So we're stuck at this point now. We're stuck at the point that we want to move towards feminist epistemology, but there's a danger of relativism here. Okay. What I find very interesting about the paper you guys surely read for today is that it provides a way of showing that this critique from mainstream epistemologists is going to fail. And it does so by doing feminist epistemology in a cool way. It basically applies a feminist analysis to mainstream epistemology. The essence of this paper is doing a kind of a self-reflection on the discipline and turning our eyes to epistemology and showing it that as a discipline, it is burdened by a lot of assumptions that are really tricky. So it's a form of constructive criticism. It shows, well, mainstream epistemologists have dominated for many, many years, and there's a reason for that. It's been very useful for us. But then when you start seeing the kinds of limitations that it has, you see that you should become a feminist epistemologist. The first example that she goes for is how a lot of epistemology that we know from mainstream epistemology focuses on knowledge that. So I know that it's raining outside. I know that today I'm going to have soup for dinner. I know that I'm going to ride my bike home. So those kinds of claims are, the bread and butter of most epistemology as we know it. But there's a different kind of knowledge that doesn't get focused on a lot. There's also knowledge how. I know how to ride a bike. Is knowing how to ride a bike knowing that you ride a bike this and this way? Like, for example, I know how to ride a bike because I know that I move my leg in this way, and I know that I move it in that way, and I'm able to propel myself forward. That seems weird. I know how to play guitar because I know if I move my fingers in this way, I make that sound. That's strange. It seems like there's a practical element of how to do things, of riding a bike, playing a guitar, that are not reducible to this kind of theoretical knowledge. So knowledge how and knowledge that seem different in a very fundamental way. So the question is, why does so much epistemology focus only on knowledge that and not on, for example, knowledge how? When you pose this question to mainstream epistemologists, they'll say something like this. Well, we should blame the ancients, because if you read Plato, he's only focused on knowledge that. He's interested in theoretical knowledge, and Plato is the foundation for all epistemology, so we have Plato to blame. Not really. This is a false claim. Because if you look at the ancients, and a lot of what they're doing in epistemology is looking at knowledge how, looking at technique, looking at the way in which we know how to do certain kinds of activities. It's really, really important for them to think about epistemology as this practical element. So Rooney's observation, which is extremely important for you to get the paper, is that philosophy, what philosophers study, depends in great part on what they're paying attention to and what are their interests. So if we are studying knowledge that in mainstream epistemology, it is in essence because some people at some point found that knowledge that was more interesting than knowledge how. And also what is sociologically relevant. So the reason why knowledge that has become the staple of epistemology, mainstream epistemology, is because it's somehow socially relevant for epistemologists to study that kind of knowledge. We'll get to that example soon. So the conclusion is, the claim of mainstream epistemologists is that epistemology is an independent field. It is not touched by questions of morality, not touched by questions of politics. It is something that has to be preserved as its own little, special little snowflake. If it isn't, then we risk relativism. If you put in politics into epistemology, then we get all these different kinds of knowledge. If you put in questions of gender or sex into epistemology, you get explosion of notions of knowledge. And that seems like a bad result. So epistemology should be ahistorical, apolitical, acultural, and free-floating. And in that sense, it shouldn't be affected by anything but epistemic factors. If epistemology really is this little domain where only epistemology counts, then the only things that can matter for what's epistemologically relevant is epistemic stuff, nothing else. But that's not the case. At some point, some people decided to focus on knowledge that. Why? Well, because it was interesting to them. It was socially relevant for them. And who is the big person to blame here? Most likely Descartes. Descartes was extremely interested in knowledge that, because part of the time which he was working in, he wanted to respond to certain kinds of considerations from the church and try to develop a new kind of science within a very, very small set of constraints of that sociological period. And he focused on knowledge that because of that. But then this means that the field of epistemology itself, the study of epistemology, is not ahistorical, apolitical, asociological, all these A things. It is deeply embedded in these kinds of considerations. So to try to excise the two kinds of things seems absolutely stupid. There's no way of you saying that epistemology as a field really is independent and free-floating. So what is essential to feminist epistemology? It provides us the tools to be able to look at these limitations, or to look at these historical, sociological, and cultural limitations of mainstream epistemology and see how they have infected epistemology. So in this sense, Rooney's paper applies feminist epistemology and puts it in action to really take a look at the field itself. And let's turn to that now. So essentially, she identifies some factors that are crucial to have in mind if you really want to provide a very clear analysis of how the field of epistemology itself is deeply, deeply relative. So the field of epistemology, what epistemology study, is relative to a specific kind of context, to a specific kind of social setting, to a specific kind of historical context. So the claim of mainstream epistemologists that feminist epistemologists are relativists actually can be turned against them themselves. So that's a kind of a genius move, is to say, mainstream epistemologists, you guys are accusing us of relativism, but you guys are just as relative as we are, which is a really cool move. All right. So essentially what I'm going to be focusing on is how we do philosophy. This is, again, turning to a more practical side of this part of the course. I focus a lot on the theory here. Now I want to kind of turn to how we actually do philosophy and how we can actually move away from these very mainstream ways of doing philosophy and go beyond the canon. I think it's a natural point for us to take the break here. It's a bit early, but it's best to then we start afresh on this topic, okay? So let's return in 15 minutes at 35.